Okay, as many of you know, when I was at the health department, we led what is called the National Salt Reduction Initiative, which is an initiative to lower the sodium levels in packaged and restaurant food. And as we did this, there were a small number of critics out there who basically said that the science wasn't fully supportive of the actions we were taking. And so what I'm going to do is try to say, in the next 15 minutes, what is the scientific rationale for what we were doing? And I've got a lot of slides, so bear with me. I'm going to try to go quickly to stay as close to within my time as possible. Before I go into the scientific evidence itself, I want to first make the case that the stakes here are high. Estimates are that if we were to reduce our salt intake by 3 grams per day, we could save between 50 and 80,000 lives per year, which that's in the order of magnitude of what progress we could make by reducing smoking rates in America today. So huge, among the most important things we could ever do to promote population health. So it really matters what all this information says to us. General background. One thing we know is that we have extraordinarily high levels of high blood pressure, of cardiovascular disease, and of sodium consumption compared to what our national recommendations, or what I think we all probably evolved eating, and I'll get more back to that later. And the argument for that most people accept is that these three are all related, that our high sodium consumption causes a high blood pressure, and that causes cardiovascular disease. But the questions that have been raised are these two, which are very closely related. The first is, does chronic level of high sodium consumption, so taking in more sodium than you should every day for 20 years or so, contribute to high blood pressure and to cardiovascular mortality? And then the closely related second question, would reductions in sodium consumption lead to reductions in blood pressure and reductions in cardiovascular mortality? Now, there are an enormous number of studies that have been done over really decades to address this question. There's no way in 15 minutes can do justice on all those studies, but I do want to sort of summarize the types of studies that have been done and the general conclusions in each category. It gets a little technical, so bear with me, but I'll try to do it a step at a time. So what's the evidence supporting the idea that increased sodium intake increases cardiovascular disease risk? First, there's some animal studies. If you give animals increased sodium, you can raise their blood pressure. That's well established for everything from mice and rats that we tend not to think as being very similar to humans, right on up to primates, including chimpanzees, which are close cousins, right? Then there are observational studies in humans. And when I say observational here, what I mean is these are studies where we're not, the researchers aren't actually giving people more sodium or not giving them more sodium. They're simply measuring how much sodium people take on their own or what their blood pressure is on its own. And one thing that is very well established is that high blood pressure increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. There's no debate about that. And the effect is very consistent and very large. So here's just an example of this where they did a meta-analysis. That means they pooled data off many studies. In this case, they have a total of 11,000 deaths, 2.7 million person years, so it's an enormous amount of data across 61 studies. And what you're seeing here is the blood pressure on the x-axis and the stroke mortality on the y-axis. And there's this consistent increase regardless of what age you are. But what's most remarkable about this to me is that the increasing line continues across the entire range of blood pressure. There doesn't appear to be a blood pressure there that's too low. It's not like there's an optimal blood pressure, you get below that, the risk goes up again. No matter what blood pressure, within the range of what they were observed, the lower is always the better, including among people who don't meet the definition of hypertension. So if your blood pressure is 135, which would not qualify you as hypertension, if you brought it down to 130, you're going to reduce your stroke risk. Then there have been a number of studies that show that if people take in more sodium, or that populations that consume more sodium have higher levels of high blood pressure, or higher blood pressures and higher levels of hypertension, including studies that are done across a very wide range of populations that are quite different, because within a population, the range of sodium consumption isn't that high. So this is my favorite study. This is a study that was called the InterSalt study done back in the 1980s, where researchers got populations from all over the world that were very, very different, including those that were like us and those people who lived in much more primitive settings, including some who are really isolated primitive groups like this here. These are isolated primitive tribes, hunter-gatherers. And here's the United States. Here's where we are. So a couple of conclusions to draw from this. First of all, overall, you see that the points seem to be on a line, that the more sodium populations consume, the higher their blood pressure. You also see that those, what I called undeveloped populations, the people who are living in less modern conditions, tend to have lower sodium consumption and lower blood pressure. And when you get to the extremes, the hunter-gatherer groups, which is probably how we evolved, their sodium consumption is much, much less than ours, probably 1/5 to 1/10 what we take in now. And what's not shown in this slide is that these people here have blood pressures that don't rise with age. That right now in this country, everybody's blood pressure rises with age. By the time you're over age 60, 2/3 of people have high blood pressure. And so we tend to assume that this is a normal part of the aging process. What this group show is that it's not a normal part of the aging process, that it seems to be correlated with having increased sodium consumption. There are also studies that show that when populations have low sodium consumption and then they migrate, people move to another area where their diet changes because they're in a new environment, their blood pressures go up. And across most samples, most studies, let me just back up for a sec here. So we have this strong connection between sodium and blood pressure and between blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. Some might say that's enough to show that there's a connection that goes 2 steps between sodium and cardiovascular disease. But then some studies have been done to look at it directly to see if does the 2-step argument hold up as well. And across most samples it does. The populations that have increased sodium consumption have increased rates of cardiovascular disease. Now then there are some intervention trials. Now remember, the key question here is not what does sodium do to you over 2 weeks or a month. It's what does it do to you over 20 years. So these intervention trials are not the perfect study for what we want to answer our question. So it really can only be done over the short term. Nonetheless, they would bear a little bit on this question. One thing we know is that if you treat high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease mortality rates go down. Anything that we've been able to do to lower blood pressure rates lowers rates of cardiovascular disease. So that says blood pressure itself is causative for cardiovascular disease. And we know that when you combine studies, like I did in the earlier trial, that if you lower sodium intake in these short-term intervention trials, you lower blood pressure. And so again, we have the 2-step connection there. But where the studies are, where we try to, here's one of them. This is probably the most well-known trial of changing sodium consumption and its effect on blood pressure. It's called the DASH trial. Randomized controlled trial. People have high, medium, intermediate, and low levels of sodium intake, and the blood pressure goes consistently down as people's sodium intake goes down. Then the question is, well, what happens if you lower sodium intake? Can you actually measure a reduction in cardiovascular disease? It's tough to do because cardiovascular disease is an outcome that probably takes 20 years or more on average to 20 years to occur. But in most samples, there is this connection between reducing sodium consumption and reduction of cardiovascular disease. So here's just 3 examples. These are 3 medium-sized trials where people were put on low sodium diets for some period of months, and then they were followed up for some period of years. And across these 3 trials, there was about a 30% on average reduction in cardiovascular disease mortality or other outcomes. So makes a pretty compelling case. And then there are population-level interventions. This subject is not new. It's been around for decades. And so different countries have undertaken large initiatives to reduce sodium consumption. It's happened in Japan, it's happened in Finland, and now more recently it's happened in the United Kingdom. All those 3 countries have managed to reduce sodium consumption and have seen a reduction in cardiovascular disease mortality. Now, other things are going on at the same time, so that itself doesn't prove it, but it is consistent with the rest of the data. So here's an example of Finland. They started focusing on this way back in the 1970s. They required high salt warnings be put on food that have high levels of sodium. Overall, over a period of about 20 years, they had a reduction of around 25% in sodium consumption, and they had about an 80% reduction in overall cardiovascular disease mortality. Now again, other things happening at the same time, this can't account for it all, but it does make one be suspicious about any claim that if we reduce sodium at the population level, we're going to see a paradoxical increase in cardiovascular mortality. So put this all together, we have a lot of different studies, none of which is perfect, but when you put them all together, it makes a very consistent picture that sodium reduction is a good thing. It should reduce blood pressure, should reduce cardiovascular mortality. So what's the, and a number of bodies have looked at this over the years. And when I say years, it's really over decades. And they have all very consistently come up with a conclusion based upon this, that we should reduce the sodium consumption in America today. So it looks like a pretty open and shut case. So what's all the controversy about? Well, the question is this, that there's a small number of critics who said, you know, these more definitive trials where you look at, try to measure the connection between sodium and cardiovascular disease, the two steps at once, they're not all consistent. They don't all show a reduction in cardiovascular disease mortality, either with a short-term intervention or these observational studies. And so they have proposed that we do some sort of definitive study to ultimately prove it. And think about that for a moment. The estimates are that it would take a minimum of about 28,000 people in such a trial to do this. It would take more than 5 years. You have to randomize people to high versus low intake. Excuse me. But the issue here is such a study is really not feasible. Think about how difficult it is to get people to follow any sort of diet. When 80% of the sodium that we take in comes in the form of packaged food, the idea that they're going to follow that at all is very difficult to imagine, let alone following it for 5 years. It's not going to happen. And then there's the final issue of ethics. I'll have to say, if I was on a review committee and this trial were sent up to me, I would say the study's not ethical. To take at least 14,000 people and tell them, no, you're going to stay on a high sodium diet for the next 5 years to see if your heart disease rates continue to be high, I wouldn't approve it. So such a trial is never going to happen. You know, the cynical side of me says that the people are proposing this because they know it's never going to happen. So what are current recommendations around sodium consumption based upon this? The U.S. dietary guidelines now say that everybody should consume less than 2,300 milligrams a day, and certain groups that are higher risk should consume less than 1,500 milligrams a day. Now, there's certain groups, those people over 50, blacks, those with hypertension, renal disease, and diabetes, that ends up being about 60% of the population. So it's a large majority of people. Now, recently, the Institute of Medicine convened a new group to look at the most recent trials to see if these recommendations should change. And they came up with this, that they still felt that everybody should consume less than 2,300 milligrams a day. But because of this question of some of those not consistent trials, they said it's insufficient evidence to determine if some people should be less than 1,500 milligrams a day. So this feels like a pretty slight difference to me in the overall recommendations. They're still saying that everybody should be less than 2,300. The question is, should some people be less than 1,500? Nonetheless, this was misreported in the media that somehow there was a big controversy and that maybe salt wasn't bad at all. Not true at all. Everybody agreed that 2,300 is something that we should be below. And where are we? Here's best estimates now about total sodium consumption. Back in the 1970s, it looks like it was around 2,300. Now, those studies were maybe not quite as well done as they are now, so maybe they were underestimating that. But now we're about 3,400, 3,500 milligrams per day on average. So virtually everybody's consuming more than what everybody recommends we ought to be consuming. Now, the National Salt Reduction Initiative has a goal to reduce sodium consumption by 25% over 5 years. If that were to succeed, where would we be? We would be up here. Okay? So we wouldn't even hit the 2,300 milligrams that everybody agrees we ought to be at. So any suggestion that the controversies around the studies imply that the National Salt Reduction Initiative is inappropriate, that's going overboard, really don't make any sense. There's a broad consensus that we ought to be at less than 2,300. So why is it we still have this controversy? Well, there are many people who legitimately raise questions about this, but not all the disagreement is based on healthy scientific skepticism. There is something called the Salt Institute. This is kind of like the Tobacco Institute. This is a membership organization of all the companies in the world that make salt. You know, I was in Congress one time when someone said, you know, there's a lobby for everything. And sure enough, there's an entire lobby for salt. And their job is to attack any science showing that salt intake is unhealthy. And there's some of the leading critics, some of the people who are most widely writing about this are funded by the salt industry. by the Salt Institute, for example, David McCarran here. And unfortunately, there's a sort of a long and I think very troubling history of some academics impeding important policy decisions with a scientific rationale after being funded by industry. So this is one that written up by some colleagues here at Columbia about the history of lead poisoning. You know, if you look back on the history, for decades there were excellent studies showing that children who ate lead paint got brain damage. And the idea was that they were getting lead poisoning. But there was one person who was widely recognized to be the leading national expert on lead poisoning. He worked at Harvard by the name of Joseph Aub. And he said, no, actually it's just the opposite. That the reason the kids are eating lead paint is because they have brain damage. And so it's the cause and effect goes in the opposite direction. So this is not the problem. And so for decades, action was not taken to reduce the lead levels in paint. And as a result, we had probably millions of children who got unnecessary brain damage. So we have to be a little cautious about some of the industry influences that get in even to the academic level. So scientific doubt is something which comes into the policy arena a lot, and so it's worth thinking about this, that in public policy making, there's a strong tendency towards inaction. In general, policy bodies look for absolute certainty of a scientific risk before they take action. That means that opponents in general don't need to prove anything. All they need to do is to introduce doubt. The doubt is sufficient to paralyze action. And so I try to figure out how do I get past this problem on this particular issue. And so I want to do something to try to reframe the question. So actually, think climate change, for example. There's nobody out there who's saying we've proven that the carbon emissions are not causing climate change. They're just trying to introduce just enough doubt to paralyze the political process. So here's a way of reframing the question. Think about what is the sodium level that maybe should be our default sodium level. What did we evolve eating as humans? Well, we humans are hunter-gatherers. We mainly evolved in the Paleolithic era. And this was the diet that we probably ate during most of our evolution as we became humans. Fruits and berries, nuts, seeds, etc. This diet tends to be very low in sodium. Throughout evolution, salt was in short supply. The reason we like the taste of salt is because we weren't getting enough, and so we were craving it. So we were driven to try to find more, but our salt consumption was probably much lower than it is right now. Best estimates are that it was less than 1,000 milligrams a day. Okay, so if we accept that, and I think we're on pretty solid grounds on that, then I want to reframe our key questions. The question is, does a chronic level of sodium consumption increase high blood pressure and cardiovascular mortality? Here's the second one. Would reductions in sodium reduce cardiovascular mortality? I'd like to reframe the second question this way. Is it safe to feed people 3 to 4 times as much sodium as we evolved eating? And when you think of it that way, most people say, well, no, given all that evidence, I'm not so sure that it's so safe. If that's the case, then the default is not where we are right now. Where we are right now is not optimal. That opponents need to prove that it is safe for us to continue to consume as much sodium as we are right now, and their evidence is not on their side. So, in general, I would conclude that scientific evidence taken in its entirety makes really a compelling case that our sodium intake is too high, and that's leading to high blood pressure and unnecessary heart disease and stroke. And so we should reduce sodium in our food supply. Inaction is dangerous. We tend to think that when we're not sure, the best thing to do is just wait and see. Actually, inaction is dangerous. When we're not sure, we ought to act. Yes, we need to do more research, and yes, we need to learn more, but we need to act, because otherwise we're going to be having tens of thousands of unnecessary deaths per year. So I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Dr. Galea, but before I do that, let me just point out again that there are legitimate scientific questions here and legitimate researchers with high scientific integrity who are asking those questions. And I put Dr. Galea in that category, but I did want to point out that not all the critics are in that category. Thanks very much.